If you care about whether American institutions still retain the raw authority to compel obedience when the subject is a former president, you need to pause right here. Not skim, not multitask. Pause. Because what just happened is not another chapter in Trump's legal saga. It is an institutional maneuver, quiet, deliberate, and destabilizing by the Supreme Court itself. The Supreme Court has just unleashed a judicial shockwave. That sentence only sounds hyperbolic until you understand how this unfolded. A sealed ruling delivered without warning, without public argument, without a visible docket trail detonated beneath Donald Trump's legal position. No press buildup, no countdown, no advance notice to allies or opponents. The system moved first, and it moved in silence. Let me say that again so it lands properly. The highest court in the United States exercised power before the public even knew there was a fight. That is not routine. That is not how this institution usually operates. And when it does, it is never accidental. According to the account we're analyzing, this was not a procedural brush-off or a narrow technical ruling. This was not a routine denial. This was the highest court in the nation tearing away a veil. And what that veil concealed is the detail that reorders everything we thought we knew. A sealed grand jury investigation running quietly for more than a year, parallel to every visible Trump case, never once entering public awareness. This is where context matters. The Supreme Court is structurally transparent by design. Cases are argued in the open. Timelines are visible. Disputes unfold in daylight. But there exists a narrow, rarely used authority to operate entirely under seal, reserved for situations where disclosure itself is deemed dangerous. If reports are accurate, that authority was invoked here. That decision alone signals gravity for the first time as described. A secret grand jury subpoena, airtight, fully sealed, traveled through the federal judiciary and reached the Supreme Court without public scrutiny. Then came the trigger moment, a 72-hour compliance deadline. No weeks, no months, 3 days. This is where the story stops being about a defendant and becomes about a system asserting control. By the time the order surfaced, Trump's legal operation was reportedly frozen. No preparation window, no narrative control, no strategic cushioning, a silent battle so deeply hidden that even Trump's lead defense attorneys were reportedly unaware. In the morning, the assumption was that all legal exposure had been mapped by midday. The ground gave way beneath him. And here is the distinction most observers will miss. This is not just another case added to the pile. It is framed as a fourth legal front, wholly separate from the classified documents case. January 6th, Georgia and New York civil fraud. This ruling represents a historic inflection point that virtually no one saw coming, which leaves us with the only question that matters before we go further. What was so consequential that the system kept it sealed for over a year? And why did the Supreme Court decide that this of all moments was when secrecy had to end? What happens in this phase is where the story stops being cinematic and starts becoming structural. This is the part most audiences never fully see, because it requires looking past personalities and into the machinery of power itself. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. At the core of this escalation is a power the Supreme Court almost never uses. The court is built on visibility. Its authority flows from openness, public dockets, scheduled arguments, decisions argued in daylight. But buried deep inside its institutional toolkit is a narrow, extreme exception: the ability to operate entirely under seal when disclosure itself is judged to be dangerous. National security, intelligence operations, situations where exposure could cause irreversible harm. As the ruling reportedly states, this extraordinary power is reserved for situations involving grave national security concerns. That sentence is not ornamental, it is a threshold. Pause here. When a court designed to be transparent decides transparency is the threat, the system is already in a different mode. According to the account, everything about this process was sealed from the start. No public filings, no televised arguments, No docket breadcrumbs for journalists to track. The subpoena was issued more than a year ago under total seal, and attached to it was a gag order. Trump was legally prohibited from telling the public, prohibited from mobilizing allies, prohibited from turning the dispute into a political spectacle. His attorneys were bound the same way. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was information containment by design. This is where the power clash becomes clear. Trump's political survival instincts rely on visibility, pressure, and noise. This process stripped all three away. There was no crowd to play to, no outrage cycle to weaponize, just courts, filings, and deadlines moving in silence. So Trump did what he always does when challenged by institutions. He reached for the familiar shields: presidential immunity, executive privilege. He leaned heavily on his well-worn legal playbook, but this time it collapsed. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, step by step. First, the trial court rejected the claims, then the appellate court followed. Each loss happened behind closed doors, unseen, unspun, uncontested in the public arena. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, this was no longer about delay. It was about finality. This is where the judiciary's tone changes. Chief Justice John Roberts reportedly wrote that the subpoena targeted conduct that falls wholly outside any credible assertion of presidential immunity. That sentence draws a hard institutional boundary between office and individual, between authority and accountability. Then came the line that signaled escalation. No further postponements will be tolerated. Read that carefully. That is not persuasion. That is enforcement language. The enforcement followed immediately. A compliance order, a fixed deadline, 72 hours precise, unforgiving, not a suggestion, a clock, and then the warning. Any failure to comply will trigger immediate civil and criminal contempt, including potential consequences that include pretrial detention. Courts do not write that way casually. That language exists to eliminate ambiguity. This is the moment where options disappear. There are no appeals left, no procedural detours, no negotiations. The Supreme Court has spoken and the system has positioned itself to compel obedience. Then comes the substance, the reason this clock exists at all. Prosecutors are reportedly demanding three categories of material, each escalating the stakes. First, complete financial records going back to 2015. Foreign transactions, loan structures, property valuations. This is not a targeted audit. It is a pattern search raising questions tied to money laundering, undisclosed foreign income, and possible violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Second, communications with foreign nationals whose identities are redacted for national security reasons. That phrase alone narrows the field. Analysts have speculated about oligarchs, foreign governments, or intelligence-linked intermediaries. Speculation aside, classification at this level is not routine. It signals counterintelligence sensitivity. Third, and most explosive documents related to efforts to obtain anything of value from foreign sources connected to electoral activity. That phrasing mirrors federal campaign finance law almost verbatim. Prosecutors choose language like that when they are mapping statutes, not fishing. This is where the system's pressure fractures the defense. According to the New York Times, Trump's lawyers learned of the ruling through breaking news alerts at Mar-a-Lago. Sources described pure chaos. According to CNN, some attorneys are considering withdrawal. According to Politico, a cooperating witness has already provided investigators with a roadmap of what to look for. Trump's response followed instinct. Attack the judges, question legitimacy, threaten non-compliance. But this is where the trap tightens. Former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman put it bluntly. Those statements amount to a written invitation for contempt proceedings. At this stage, intent no longer needs to be inferred. It has been declared. And when the judiciary reaches this point, it is no longer watching rhetoric. It is watching compliance. This is where the Story narrows to a single pressure point. No procedural exit, no narrative escape hatches, no time left to reshuffle the board. Donald Trump now stands before two paths, and both carry consequences he has spent more than a year trying to outrun. The first is compliance. Turn over the records, financial data, foreign transactions, communications, electoral material. If he complies, the wall of secrecy collapses instantly. Whatever he fought quietly, relentlessly, and at every level of the judiciary to keep hidden is no longer theoretical. It enters the possession of prosecutors. It becomes evidence. The risk is no longer political, it becomes institutional. The second path is defiance. Refuse, stall, submit partial compliance, and trigger contempt. Not symbolic contempt. Not a procedural reprimand, but the kind of contempt the Supreme Court reserves for moments when authority itself is being challenged. The warning is explicit. The consequences could include detention before any trial on the underlying conduct even begins. That is how unprecedented this moment is. The phrase now hanging over the system is one. It almost never has to confront a former president jailed for contempt. Not after a verdict, not after a conviction, but for refusing to obey the court. This is where the shockwave spread. According to the Washington Post, Trump's allies are not just worried about this case, they are panicking about what it implies. If one sealed investigation reached the Supreme Court without public awareness, could there be others? What else might be moving through the system, unseen, unannounced, and already advanced? That uncertainty alone destabilizes every defense strategy built on the belief that all threats are visible. Public opinion is shifting in quieter but consequential ways. According to YouGov, even among Republican voters, a core principle still holds. No one is above the law. That matters because institutions ultimately survive not just through enforcement, but through collective acceptance of legitimacy. Legal scholars are already framing this historically. Lawrence Tribe has called it the most consequential Supreme Court action since United States versus Nixon, not because the facts are identical, but because the logic is power meets a limit, secrecy meets a deadline, authority demands obedience, 72 hours short, volatile, irreversibly. So, here's the question that now hangs over everything. Does a former president comply with the Supreme Court? Or does he force the American system to decide how far it is willing to go to prove that its authority still holds? Before you step away, share your perspective in the comments. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit like and subscribe, then turn on notifications so you don't miss the most critical political developments as they break day after day. See you next time.